Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thought on Tap. My name is Bretton Rodriguez, and I am a teaching assistant professor in core humanities, as well as one of the founders and co-organizers of Thought on Tap. If you're new to Thought on Tap, welcome. We are a public engagement series that brings together diverse faculty, staff, students, and community members for important conversations around timely topics on the second Thursday of every month during the fall and spring semesters. We are brought to you by the Core Humanities Program, Laughing Planet, and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Nevada, Reno. Our theme for this academic year is Legacies. This fall, we discuss confronting legacies. First, of health disparities in October, then of voter suppression in November, and finally of policing and violence in December. In the spring, we are building legacies of equity in education. That's what we're doing today. Health and healing, activism and social justice, and also economic empowerment. So the plan for tonight. So we'll be with you until 6:30. Along with the Zoom, where I assume most of you are watching, you can also see us live on YouTube if you go to thoughtontap.com/YouTube. And the way this will work is first I'll introduce our fantastic panelists who are incredible. And then I'll go ahead and introduce the theme for today, and then we'll go ahead and get into our questions. I have some questions prepared, but after the first two or three, I would love for you all to go ahead and jump in with your own questions as well. All right, so let's go ahead and let's start with the introductions. So our first panelist is Dr. Cynthia Alcantar. She is an assistant professor of higher educational leadership at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her research focuses on the social mobility and integration of racial/ethnic minorities and immigrant populations in the United States, with a particular focus on the influence of schools on the educational pathways and civic partnerships of racial/ethnic minorities and immigrant students. Before UNR, she was a postdoctoral scholar at Pitzer College and a researcher for the Institute for Immigration, Globalization, and Education at the University of California, Los Angeles. She also has extensive experience working in K-12 and higher education settings, including TRIO grant programs at Norco Community College and Claremont Graduate University, the Title V Hispanic Serving Institutions Grant Program at Mount St. Mary's College, Norte Vista High School, and John Adams Elementary in Southern California. She also consults with school districts, community colleges, and four-year colleges concerning the campus climate and culture for supporting underrepresented student populations. She earned her Ph.D. in social science and comparative education at UCLA. Cynthia, would you say hello, please?
Hello, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
You're very welcome. Our next panelist is Donald Easton-Brooks. Dr. Easton-Brooks is the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Nevada, Reno. Dr. Easton-Brooks is also internationally recognized as a critical, quantitative, culturally responsive scholar. His scholarship covers more than 100 manuscripts, blogs, podcasts, op-eds, presentations, keynotes, and keynotes. Easton-Brooks is best known for introducing the concept of ethnic matching to the field of education. Dr. Easton-Brooks has received a number of awards and recognition for his research and work, including the 2019 Philip C. Chin Book Award from the National Association of Multicultural Education for his book, Ethnic Matching, Academic Success in Students of Color. His research has been cited on educational initiatives and policy efforts in the United States and in places such as Africa, Australia, India, Germany, and New Zealand. He is a section editor of the soon-to-be released Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and is on the editorial board of the Urban Education Journal. The impact of his work has led to the national and international interviews on television, radio talk shows, newspaper, and parenting magazines, and now Thought on Tap. I'm sure his highest, all the way at the top of the list. His work has also, thank you. His work has also been key in creating high school pathway programs designed to promote equity in education by moving to diversify the educator workforces and in developing culturally responsive teachers. He is part of the American Educational Research Association series, Senior Scholars on Advancing Research and Professional Development Relating to Black Education. Donald, would you say hello, please?
Hello, everyone. Great to be here.
Welcome. All right, and our final panelist, but definitely not least, definitely not last, but anyways, you know what I mean. So Tiffany Young, M.Ed, is currently the Director of Equity and Diversity for Washoe County School District. Her work is within systems to support and clarify the role of equity, diversity, and cultural competency interwoven into all schools, departments, and systems. leading work around programs, policies, and practices that must be addressed through an equitable and culturally responsive lens, as well as creating and facilitating professional learning around equity and cultural competency. Ms. Young owns Tiffany Young Consulting, LLC, working with organizations to provide training and strategic planning. Ms. Young is also an adjunct professor in human development and family studies department at the University of Nevada, Reno, a public speaker, training, workshop facilitator, and community collaborator at heart. In 2019, Tiffany traveled to Zambia to co-facilitate a training of trainers model for girls under the age of 25, and educators from peri-urban areas, including Garden, Kamwala, Matero, Mutenderi, and Chawama, as part of the Mandela Washington Fellowship Reciprocal Program. The training of trainers guided volunteers of She Entrepreneur to integrate into trainings lessons that addressed the social needs of young mothers, mostly adolescents, who are part of the She Entrepreneur program. Secondly, for educators to incorporate lessons on cross-cultural communication, diversity, inclusion, and equity through the She Entrepreneur program. So Tiffany, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for our wonderful discussion today and to be on this panel with these esteemed colleagues. So,
thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. So just to provide a little bit of background really quickly, and then to get out of your way, really, just speaking about education, education has a fundamental role in society. In many ways, it shapes who we are, the way that we think, and how we interact with society. Historically, education has also been a vehicle of economic and social mobility. Despite its importance, there are and have been for a long time serious issues with the educational system in the United States. Many of these issues revolve around the need for equity in education, or in other words, ensuring that every student has an opportunity to succeed. Unfortunately, all students in the United States do not have the same educational opportunities. For instance, many students face discrimination based on their gender, ethnic origin, or socioeconomic status, lack access to education, or lack of access to the high quality of education that is offered to more privileged groups and communities within the United States. For instance, in many states, districts with the highest rates of poverty receive far less funding than more affluent districts. To provide one concrete example, as of 2018, high poverty districts in Illinois received about 22% less funding than more affluent districts. Furthermore, on average, U.S. school districts serving the largest populations of Black, Latinx, and Native students receive roughly $1,800 less per student in state and local funding than those serving the fewest students of color. Although that might not seem like a huge number, for a school of 5,000 students, that would translate to a deficit of roughly $9 million. The distribution of funding has serious consequences, and more than half of all students who drop out of high school are students of color. And most of these students are also from low-income communities. In addition, historically marginalized students are far less likely to attend a four-year institution than their peers. At the same time, they are far more likely to be suspended, expelled, or drop out of such institutions. This lack of access to quality education, as well as a frequent lack of support within the educational system, including the lack of a diverse educator workforce, has led to an increased economic inequalities, as well as severely limiting the opportunities for people of color and individuals from low-income communities to succeed and thrive in the United States today. This type of division in society has long-lasting ramifications and negative consequences, not just for individuals, but also for communities, cities, and the country as a whole. Whew. All right, so now the fun bit. Now I get to ask you all questions and I get to get out of the way. So the first question is really incredibly broad, but I do want to start broad and then hopefully we can get more specific as we go. So question one, what does equity in education look like? And how is this different from the current situation? So Cynthia, I thought we'd start with you and then we'll move on to Tiffany and then Donald after that. So Cynthia, go ahead.
Well, you know, so at one end, it's recognizing difference, right? So looking at equity in terms of, oftentimes like before getting to like having a bigger discourse around equity, there was a lot of conversation around equality, right? Like that, does everyone have an equal access to education, equal access to different opportunities? Since then, a lot of different folks, educators, scholars, and a lot of different folks have been pushing back on that idea because equality doesn't necessarily get at the differences in terms of equity and in access, in opportunity for different groups. So at one end is looking at differences of different groups, differences in outcomes, differences in experiences, different groups, as you mentioned a lot of different types of equity issues for different groups, whether it's by race, ethnicity, country of origin, immigrant background or experiences, gender equity, sexuality issues, different ways to look at it, women, men, all kinds of ways. So at one end is that. So it's recognizing differences in outcomes and experiences for different groups. I'll stop right there because I think we also have some great folks here that could speak even more so on some of these issues. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. Tiffany, do you want to go ahead?
What I would add to what Cynthia stated is I think we need to step back for a minute and redefine what we think the definition of equity is. So from a K-12 perspective, any district you go to, it's going to look different. And so equity can be solely a race conversation. Then equity can be a funding conversation, and the equity can be a resource conversation. But I use the analogy of the prescription eyeglasses all the time. So if Donald and I go to the doctor next week and the eye doctor says, you know what, both of you need to be able to see. And to Cynthia's point, then he will equally give us a prescription. But the equitable approach would mean that he would find out individually what prescription we need to see. And so when we think about equity in that standpoint, what do we individually need to provide for students, whether it be teachers, faculty at higher ed? And when we think about a system-wide structure, equity is a system conversation where there have been continuous institutionalized barriers and practices that have not been disrupted for us to truly have the outcomes we need in schools. So when I think about equity, I can't just think about it from a classroom conversation. It needs to be a system-wide approach.
That sounds great. Thank you. Donald, do you want to jump in here as well?
Sure, and I would add to that, and I think they both give great analogies, and I think Cynthia's right. We've come at this at the beginning from looking at equity versus equality, and what we really need to do is take that lens of what equity means. Equal in some places is needed. When we talk about equal pay for an equal job, yes. But when we start talking about that equity, and as you mentioned, Brother Rodriguez, about that whole notion of opportunity, and it's about equity so that we can provide opportunity. And so when we think about this notion of equity from a system level, from a classroom level, from how we've existed in making policies, we have not thought about groups of people. Equity, and I think Tiffany says it so correctly, equity has to be looked at in a lens that you look at a community and look at what the needs are of the community and provide fair opportunities for those communities to take advantage of whatever service is being provided. So when we think about education, I think oftentimes we've really tried to think about what's equal rather than thinking about what's equitable and what communities need to be successful. Now, while we have groups in our classrooms or in our schools that are diverse, oftentimes we think that equity suggests that what we do for the Latinx population is what we should do for the Black population, is what we should do for the Native population. And not understand, even within those groups, there are different impacts or different things that impact those groups that make equity different. When we talk about language in our Latinx population, we need to understand that even within that, we have to think about the origin of Spanish. As we think about the Spanglish from maybe LA, that's different from the Spanglish from maybe Oakland. When we think about New Ricans in New York and all the different things in which we're engaged in, we can't say that we apply the same thing to those groups and expect equitable outcomes. And we can use that same notion as we think about Blacks in schools. If you think about the Cuban Blacks, think about Dominicans, which can also be Latinx. So you think about those of African descent. And we really, and even our New World Africans that are now coming to the US. And we really have to really stay back and think really critically about what equity means and what it's about. Now, I've presented some complex things about equity, but it doesn't mean equity is complex. It's very simple if you take that step back and think about engaging with people from where they're coming from.
Can I add one other thing too?
Please, go for it.
I think I like what Tiffany brought up too, of like, it's looking at it system wide, right? So what are the systemic issues that are happening? How does it impact different people? And sometimes I think when we are where we fall short sometimes in terms of having these conversations is we might say, but we have Tiffany in Washoe School District. We've checked the mark, like we've already addressed equity issues because she's looking at diversity and looking at all these kinds of things. And so, yes, we have that one, but are we, on one level, are we supporting her? Like, are we giving her all the resources to do her job or, how she wants to do it? But then she's leading efforts across the district. And so then the districts have to change as a system in order to have an impact then on students. So the system meaning policy, resources, funding, yeah. But then it's, the teachers, it's the administrators, it's, how are the students experiencing the schools and their outcomes? And they're part of communities, right? Especially when we're talking about public schools, especially, but all schools, but especially public schools, because they're charged with that mission to serve those communities. And so, so that to add that other layer, that, it's not as easy as like, yes, we have that one person now, we checked off the mark, that little checkbox. It's a bigger question.
And let me add to that so that Tiffany doesn't get herself in trouble. So the question, I think the answer to that question is no. And I think it's no because we again, as Cynthia so rightfully said, we say because we have a person in that position, we're ready to go. But we don't think about those resources that it takes to get that done. And it doesn't necessarily mean, she needs books. I mean, it's a matter of listening to her and saying, here are the challenges we're facing, and we really need resources if we want to do this and do this effectively. And as we think about that, and I think Cynthia is right, that when Tiffany talks about this, we have to break it down. There are systematic things within this that we have to look at, and we have to really look and see, are we really matching where these equitable needs are, and really listening to where these equitable needs are. And I think if we don't do that, we miss the boat. And then what we say is that we've tried to deal with equity, but Tiffany didn't X, Y, and Z. And then we bring someone else in, and they keep saying the same thing that Tiffany said. And then we keep running into the same cycle because we're not paying attention to the narrative. Sometimes with equity, and I think that Cynthia brought this up before, sometimes with equity, we still get people that are not clear on what this means and want to say equal. Or we have people that want to say, we provided an opportunity by providing this position. That should be enough. And we've been struggling with this for generations. The Bilingual Act. How many times have we adjusted the Bilingual Act? And we keep saying, well, it's all right now. No, it's not all right now. And we have to really step back and think about, are our desires or our intentionality, does those things, do they match what it is we're trying to do from a resource lens? And that's what's critical and important. When we talk about STEM and want to embrace and engage STEM, we put all the resources available in STEM to get it done. We need to have that same effort when we're talking about this very human issue of equity.
So I think that's a great transition. I think both of you gave there's so many different ways we can go right now. I think it's fantastic. But I want to pick up in particular on what maybe some of these challenges are here in Washoe County and where they are kind of on the high school level, what they are in the school system here. So Tiffany, maybe you could speak a little bit about what some of the specific challenges are that you're facing and maybe some of the ways that you're approaching these challenges as well.
I will say in Washoe, we have both unique to Washoe challenges, and then we have similarities to other district challenges. The challenge with equity is that it's equity, right? So you have to commit. And it means that we're going to intentionally lean in. We're going to fight when people don't agree. We're going to make provisions when necessary. We're going to step back, check our biases. We're going to acknowledge that we have institutionalized racism and institutionalized practices. We're going to be willing to get real uncomfortable and own some things. We're going to acknowledge disproportionate practices in hiring, student achievement. We're going to have to systematically commit. And we have to understand that people have certain levels of power and privilege where they can choose to no longer commit. they can step out when it gets to be too difficult and then leave that weight. And then you have this wake of things that have happened. So some of the challenges that I know we have in Washoe is that it is not a small district, and people think that equity should happen because we say we want equity. You have to understand that systematically from top down and side to side, that work needs to happen and it needs to be continuous. So we can't have people going, I was equitable today. It doesn't work that way. Equity is a mindset, and it also is a commitment and ownership to review your policies and decide whether or not you have any unintentional barriers to your hiring practices, to review your grading policies to see if you are disproportionately monitoring what's happening with students, to understand how your funding sources, and you're not leaving money on the table where money could be used in other places. Also acknowledging whether or not you are in fact building capacity for the people to engage in the equity work. We cannot slap equity onto a district or a university like a Band-Aid and not provide the healing that needs to happen for people to be successful.
So there's a question here in the chat. And also I would encourage anyone, if you have questions, please, you can throw them in the Q&A, throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you all. But there's a question here about charter schools. So I was wondering, either Tiffany, you or anyone else who wants to jump in, if you want to speak a little bit about the way that charter schools relate to this as well. Do they exacerbate inequality, or do they make it more difficult? What's the relationship that you see, and maybe how do you see things going in the future as well?
You know, I would not, it would not be fair to say charter schools, right, as a whole. I think it depends on the charter school, and it depends on the structure, and it depends on what the competition looks like. We know that there are districts, and in ours, we have a little bit of that conversation around choice. And so when you have a person that has been in a system for so long and all of a sudden they choose to go somewhere else, we cannot just point our finger at the place they went to. We need to examine why they left. And that sometimes are things we don't look at. And so we can't blame charter schools as a whole. We can maybe look at what's happening within the structure of how they're set up to be able to answer that question. And then we also have to ask ourselves, is there something they're offering that we're not? We know that school systems aren't in control over all funding that comes to them. That's a statewide decision. And so if we don't really think about the legislative process, the per capita funding that happens, the school district's not at fault for that because they're not in control of that. They're doing with what they've been given. But if they don't have an equitable approach to disseminate those things, then it's going to land in what happens in our buildings. And if charter schools have less autonomy to be able to do that, then maybe that will allow them some room to be able to make some of these decisions. But I don't think it's fair to say an and or an if or the other one is better as a whole. But I think those are things that you want to really look at and consider.
Let me add to this a little bit, and I think Tiffany is so right. We do have some charter schools that are really impactful and really effective, and sometimes they get wrapped into those that are not really focused on the needs that we're talking about. But here's something from a systematic lens that's important to think about when you think about equity. When we think about our schools, our public schools across the nation, when we look at our public schools and who's leaving or pushed out, we have to think about, as Tiffany said, why. But here's something that we have to understand. Of those who leave schools for private schools, it's 75% white. Of those who leave schools for charter schools, it's 65% of color. And so when we think about school choices and where students are going, we're suggesting there's something within the system that's not working that are pushing these students out, but the choice these students are able to make or these families are able to make are quite different. The point is, and it's a point that was brought up earlier, is that we have to think about our funding. And if we're funding our schools at the level that they're able to do what they're supposed to do, we wouldn't be pushing out our students. And we wouldn't really be pushing out our students of color who families are looking for the best opportunity for their children. But when we do that and we push out students to either charter schools or to private schools, we still have this population within public schools that we're not addressing at the level we need to address it. My bias is that we need more funding for schools. that we need more funding for schools and put resources in the right places so we're not pushing students out. And what's challenging is that we have corporations that are getting involved in this at a level that they don't understand the equitable things that they're affecting. I think about Seattle public schools. Up until about 4 years ago or so, they didn't have charter schools or alternative schools. But the Bill Gates Foundation goes in and they funded this push for a vote for charter schools. But you're talking about a city with a very high achievement rate among their BIPOC population. But now charter schools are coming in, and that's going to change the dynamic of what we understand about those population and equity as it relates to that. And so that's a critical thing you bring up. I think Tiffany is right. We can't measure them all the same. But if we're funding schools, this wouldn't even be a conversation.
So there's a question that just came through, which I think is a good follow-up question here as well. And that has to do with funding based on test scores for public schools. So the questioner asks, is this something that we should improve upon? Is this something we should scrap? So how do you feel about kind of this process of, kind of pegging funding based on test scores? Cynthia, do you want to maybe start off here and then we could go from there?
I mean, I could speak on it more so on the higher ed level. So, I mean, because there's while in the K-12 system, there might be, regarding test scores. In the higher ed system, it's about performance of the colleges and being compared against one another. So the community college is compared against the four-year college in terms of funding in terms of state funding. And so I could speak on it in the higher ed level, or maybe we could turn it over to the the experts of the K-12 system, and then I could tie it into the higher ed. How would you?
Yeah, why don't we'll start. So Tiffany, maybe we'll start with you, and then Cynthia will come back to you afterwards if that works.
Well, I don't know if we have enough time to actually have a funding testing conversation. To be honest, I can tell you that before I started working in public education, I thought that these things were simple fixes. You ask a question, why can't this just happen? But there is such a long line that needs to be unwoven around testing. And you can have the conversation around the bias in testing, the purpose of testing, who's getting paid for the testing, why are we testing, and what did the testing actually show us, right? And so those layers of conversation lead us to how we land in higher ed, right? So that's the path that we go to. This is a P26 situation, early childhood to career. And so we have a K-12 conversation, we have a higher ed conversation. We should be having a P26 conversation continuously. And testing, we need to really step back and ask, what is it actually doing? And who is creating it? And what is the purpose? And for that funding, if I wouldn't say take testing completely off the board, but I would say maybe redirect the funding and restructure what we're doing with testing and why we're testing students, just to find out, get a better handle on what it's actually doing for us, because we have such brilliance in our students and such levels of gift and talent and knowledge that we have created an atmosphere based on testing that has now caused our young people to believe that they are not intelligent because they are not doing well on tests. And so the test does not determine your intelligence and the test does not determine your ability, but that's the system that we've built and that's the challenges that we face. So no one's going to say, yeah, we're going to just scrap all of that. So I say we need to redirect that funding and restructure the purpose and the use and figure out what our true outcomes are and consider who it is that are creating the test and what they're creating the test for.
And I think so to lead into this, the whole, K through 20 and beyond conversation too. So if those things are happening in the K-12, like one, it's like, so students who are maybe not benefiting from the particular system that we've created, potentially they're not coming into our colleges. So we're losing out on particular knowledges and experiences that may enrich our learning and opportunity in the higher education system. I think on another level too, that we often focus, it is a good thing, right? We're focusing on the students and outcome, but also even the educators. So in higher education, we're training the educators. We're having these conversations. We're building, we're developing, and helping develop like our future leaders who are making decisions about these funding structures, who are making decisions in terms of our testing. And so even in higher ed, like not only are we playing a role, like a very direct role in terms of the training and so forth, what we provide and an opportunity for our students, but we're having a greater impact in terms of thought process too. So like as a faculty member, I could say like in my classes, we're having these conversations because to me, it's important that my future, my graduate, I mostly teach graduate level classes, but my graduate students who are pursuing leadership positions in higher ed and in K-12, they need to know how this impacts different students in different ways and what role they could play once they're coming into these systems. Because yeah, like Tiffany says, and sometimes, this is a very typical thing. And even in my grad papers, like I push them to say like, what are the implications of whatever topic they were talking about? And often it's a question around, they'll say something like, well, we need more funding. Well, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? And where will that money go? And how will we think about money and how it's distributed? Like we've talked about a little earlier too. What does all that mean? And then like even this question about whether do we even have testing? So in higher education, aside from the state testing that happens in the K-12 level, we also have the admissions tests, right? That are also very inequitable in terms of outcomes for students of color, and in terms of having access even into higher education. So even in that sense, we're also playing a role. And some states have decided to use, like, for example, the ACT as a form of their state measurement in terms of outcomes of their students, their student learning outcomes. But then, what role are we playing in higher education? And so I think the comment from Tiffany saying that we need to be thinking about K-20 and beyond is very critical because it's not isolated, and we tend to work in silos. Even within the institutions, we tend to work in silos, and we need to stop doing that.
Can I add a quick to this? These two wonderful minds have explained this greatly. There are a couple of things to think about with testing. And I think Tiffany said it correctly. Why? Why are we doing this? 20% of our curriculum and testing, 20% of our curriculum and testing is, our curriculum and testing is based on 20% of the population. Suburban, white, two-family, heterosexual household. While our schools are more than 50% of color. And we're saying to a population, we want you to be like this. Knowledge, language, culture culture and life impacts perceptions and how we perceive things. When we start talking about testing and talk about competencies, we start to miss the boat. About over a decade ago, I did a study. It kind of age hit you. I did a study over a decade ago, and I wanted to look at the difference in the achievement gap between comprehension versus proficiency. Comprehension suggests you read a text and you can comprehend the whole thing and you give answers to it. Proficiency suggests that you look at pieces of what you're trying to measure. Do students understand sounds of letters? Do they understand words in context? Do they understand pieces? When I looked at these two things, I saw that, there was an achievement gap based on test scores, but there was not an achievement gap based on proficiency scores, based on the type of things you need to know about reading. So when we give these students these comprehensive tests and they don't do well, we say, oh, they can't read. That's not true. And then when we start to put these biases on what testing means as it relates to race, that becomes part of the psyche. And as Cynthia talks about, when we look at this whole notion of college entry, and then we start even look at COVID in college entry, who's getting access to tutoring for SET and ACT? If you don't have the money, you're not doing it. And so when we look at this college entrance, we're saying these test scores matter, but we're missing the boat on looking at those skills, that talent that students are bringing to the table. And I look at a place like California, for instance, they're starting to move away from just ACT and SET. We're starting to look at other type of factors that can help look at students' ability to be successful and bringing it to a point of being more equitable and then opening up to diversity to happen.
So I think all these responses are really, really fascinating. I want to change the conversation slightly. So this is actually building a little bit off something you said, Cynthia. So looking a little bit at the educators. So kind of moving from the students and the student responses, so looking at the educators and their role in all of this. And so one of the questions here asks, how would you recommend that we better prepare, educate teachers and administrators, both in K through 12 and also in higher education, to utilize pedagogy that is grounded in equity? So kind of moving from the students to the educators a little bit. So anyone who wants to kind of jump in and kind of think about ways that we could really prepare teachers to answer these questions or kind of engage with these issues.
Well, I think I'm on the other side of that. So I get the teachers after they've prepared them. And so then I do the other level of coaching. So we actually lead the professional learning around cultural competency. And I think some of the things we have to understand is that when we think about Washoe, for instance, it's considered a majority minority school district. So we're about 57% students of color in Washoe County School District. And then with our teachers being a majority white, and there seems to be oftentimes, in some cases, this misnomer that a majority of our white teachers cannot teach our students of color. And what I would say to that is that is not true if they don't have the skills necessary. They haven't had the proper education and training. And vice versa, if the majority of our teachers were teachers of color and being able to teach our students of color, it's not a bonus that you get automatically because you're a shade of brown. But if you don't have the tools, if you have not been prepared in your program, and then you come into a system where then you have someone like me that has to train, and we have to unravel some things that have just been ingrained in you for so long, then we have those challenges that we have to face. And so when I see what's happening with UNR College of Ed, and I see what's happening with, College of Ed and Human Development, and now with the College of Liberal Arts, some intentionality of providing context to the content, then we can do a better job of who walks into our schools to teach our students. Because we have to understand that just because you're licensed doesn't mean you know how to teach. And if we don't give you the tools necessary to continue to have the capacity growth, we're going to do a disservice to our students. Black, brown, white, gay, straight, lesbian, queer, questioning, intersectionality, poor, native, you keep going. It doesn't give you this bonus to walk into a space if we haven't provided the capacity you need to be successful.
Amen and amen. I would have to say with that as well, she's so right. One of our challenges in what we do, and this is something I push even in our school, our college, and on the state level, we can't require one course in multicultural education and say they got it. No, it has to be integrated. It has to be woven. And as Tiffany said, it has to be, there's an intentionality that has to be there. And until we correct that, we're going to continue to get the same things. I did a study that's part of the book that I wrote on teachers and their use of cultural responsive practice and multicultural ed. Over 90%, over 95% of white teachers said they took that course in their training. Over 95% of teachers of color said they took that course in their training. When I asked, do you use this? And I interviewed about 450 teachers. And I asked, if you use this in your training, over 90% of Black teachers said yes. I think a higher percent of Latinx teachers said yes. About 65% of white teachers said yes. And when asked, why don't you use it if you don't use it? The main reason is because schools didn't show that it was valued. They feel like they didn't have training even though they took the class. And I agree with the training part. Or there was some factors that really was associated with just not having an understanding. And that again, it comes to you take one class, you're not going to get it. And it's a relationship. You can't go on one date and say, we're going to get married and we know everything about each other. You have to engage. You have to be intentional about having intentionality about that. And until we correct that and change it and make it more integrated, and until we work with our schools and work with our departments like the one that Tiffany's a part of, we're going to continue to miss the boat. In higher ed, we can talk about it a lot, but if we're not engaging with that transition, it's not going to work. And then we get these students to college And then Cynthia has to have this conversation again about how do we get you to understand this, because they've had an experience that tells them that equity doesn't matter.
And I think, I mean, something that Tiffany brings up too is this continual learning, right? So one, we train them, but then is there opportunities at their school sites to be able to engage in these conversations and engage in the conversations in the changing context of our society, right? Because it's not just, you know, one class, one training where you talk about, oh, there's differences and then there's inequities. Well, you know, things evolve, things change. There's historical, societal things that are happening that we should be talking about so that they could think about, well, how does that apply and how can I implement it within my classrooms in a way that is productive, right? Because sometimes, you know, we may teach in terms of like, what are some equity issues, but then what do you do with it? Like, and sometimes it comes off in a bad way. Like sometimes, like I said, I train mostly, you know, graduate students. And so it could mean that maybe if I don't continue having these conversations, it could mean that they take that and then there'll be the faculty in the classrooms one day saying like, so Cynthia, you're Latina, you know, what do you think? We just talked about that, you know, so that we have to have these continued conversations and across the board, not just one class. I totally agree with that. And not just for your white teachers and educators, for your non-white too, because I mean, I've experienced those things with educators who are not white and who have very problematic views in terms of our education system and the way they treat other students of color. And so it's everybody who has to have these conversations. Same with like, we're having, you know, even with faculty. So at one level is like, what is the curriculum requirements for their certifications for them to teach, right? So that's one thing. Okay, well, the school, you know, could be teaching particular classes and how can we institute diversity and equity issues being discussed in those classrooms? But then, you know, what about the other classes? You know, are the other faculty teaching in that way too? Are they having these equity conversations? And not just in education and the social sciences, because a lot of times in higher education, that falls into those disciplines and not in others, or they're not either forced or talked about, or maybe they get that one training across the institution that, you know, people just keep on clicking and not really thinking about how it applies. And so, so I think it's continued learning. It's across the board. And then thinking about having those conversations about how you do it. And I would add that it's not just teachers that are going into our K-12 systems and future faculty, but then it's also our counselors and even training. Like we're often talking about educators and we know they have a key role, but even like our frontline workers, the folks that are in the front desk, and how do they treat our our families? You know, coming from a background where my parents were Spanish speaking only, like, I mean, so many times I had to either translate as a 6-year-old for my parent or, you know, having to deal with negative interactions because they thought of my mom as less. And so what does that mean for me and how you see me in your school? So I think it's training across the board. It's beyond educators. It's everybody who's interacting with our students in our communities.
And on the side note, sorry, real quick on a side note, we have to make sure that we understand that speaking Spanish in the United States is not illegal. We have no national language in our country. There's nothing illegal about speaking another language in our country. And sometimes you make it seem like, oh, we should only speak English. No, we don't have that in our country.
So I think these are all really, really great points. I want to kind of think a little bit about the makeup of the workforce, a little bit of this kind of educated workforce in particular, and think a little bit about why it's so important, why it's so necessary that we have not just, that we think about equity in the workforce as well. And so the question I want to ask is kind of, first of all, why is it so important that we have equity in the educated workforce? And then secondarily, how do we promote a more diverse educated workforce as well? I mean, this is often something that we don't see promoted. So how do we get there, basically? Tiffany, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'd love to. And this is a conversation that I have on an ongoing basis. And one of the things we have to remember is that diversity in the workforce is not just brown people. So let's just clear that up, because we have done such a poor job of using language, and to the point that Donald and Cynthia made. And we think about whether you speak another language, language is a gift, it is not a barrier. The barrier is the inability to communicate. Okay, I'm off that soapbox. But what we have to say is that when we think about a diverse workforce, what are we talking about? Are we talking about men? Are we talking about women? Are we talking about people of different racial and ethnic identities? Are we talking about people with different gifts and talents? And so we need to, first of all, clarify that. I see strategic plans and department plans, and they say we want to increase our diverse workforce. What does that mean? And if you do it, what happens then? Do you in fact have an environment that will welcome the diversity? Will you hear the voice of the diverse people? Will you take the feedback and put it into practice? Have people been hired, retained, and promoted? It is not just a simple conversation that people have all the time. And so when we talk about why is it important, it's important because we have like-minded people sitting around the table making like-minded decisions, giving us like-minded results. And so if we want to truly change things, then we need to change who is sitting around the table, and not for the sake of checking a box, but with power, with decision, with shifting, and so that we can really ensure the outcomes that we need. So diversity, for the sake of putting it on the strategic plan, does nothing for me, my children, or my grandson. But if you're going to institutionalize it into practice, then that means you're going to truly understand what a diverse workforce is.
Sister Tiffany had put on the gloves tonight, just punching and swinging. That's good, good. And I think she's right. I think we have to help our community understand that we can't use that word diversity loosely. When we talk about people of color, we can't even use that loosely because we still have to think about that language piece that's very critically important to a lot of our immigrant brothers and sisters. That's critical. We have to think about our LGBTQ community. We have to really embrace the notion of what diversity means. But when it comes to this notion of equity, ethnic diversity, this ethnic and linguistic diversity, it's very critical and important. And this is where my research comes into play. I looked at if Black kids had a Black teacher, how would that impact their academic outcome? And I found that if a Black student had at least one Black teacher between kindergarten and fifth grade, they do significantly better over time in math and in science than those Black students who had not one teacher of color. Now, let me give a side note to this. This is not to imply that every Black teacher can do this work, but it implies there's something there that connects these students. And there have been follow-up studies to mine with the Latinx population that have shown the same thing, but the Asian population in math that have shown the same things, that there is a connection there that's very important and critical. I also found those states and those districts that have a more diverse workforce, their achievement gap between the BIPOC population and white population is smaller than those that have a larger gap between teachers of color and students of color. And that's something that statistically is different. And we talk about a place like Washoe County where we have 89% of the teachers white and over 50% of the teachers of color, students of color. That's a huge gap. That's hugely different than any other school. And then another thing, with one of the follow-up studies to all this stuff that I did, I looked at teachers' intentionality. How intentional are you in creating a culture responsive workforce and able to do it in a way that engages students for success? And success was not measured by grade point average, and it wasn't measured by how well you did on a test. I let the teachers talk about how success looked. Some teachers said attendance increased. If attendance increased, students are there. Participation in class increased. If they're participating, they're there. Of those white teachers who I found had a high level of intentionality, that they were very intentional in this, I wanted to find out why. And what I found is that those white teachers who worked in the school with at least 30% of the workforce of color were much better able to work in a culture responsive lens than those who did not. And the only thing I can conclude from this is that, as Tiffany talked about, who's at the table? Who are you having conversations with? If I worked in a space where it was, and I use analogy a lot, if I worked in a space where I'm working with males and I'm having a problem with my wife, and I go and talk to males about my problem with my wife, I'm going to get that male lens, and I'm still going to get home and sleeping on the sofa. I need some females to help me understand what's wrong with this male brain and get it right. And we need that diversity as we interact and engage so that we're better able to interact and engage with our young people and with each other as we're doing this difficult work of teaching.
And I say it impacts, I mean, it's not just the student that it impacts, right? In our educator workforce and diversity there and, you know, all those things, but then even beyond that. So then, you know, what does it look like in terms of workforce beyond the K-12, beyond higher ed? And we're seeing that impact in terms of even our, you know, COVID and the pandemic, right? And the lack of diversity in the health fields. And so like, and I'll give you an example. In the community where my parents live, it's a majority Mexican immigrant population. The COVID vaccine rollout and even just information about COVID, it's been very limiting in terms of the information reaching out to the immigrant communities. Either it's inaccurate or there is just none at all. And it's interesting that just recently a newspaper came out that the folks who are in charge of the rollout of all these things are just now realizing that they did not do enough outreach to the Latino and Spanish speaking community just now, like literally it was just published like this week. And so, you know, luckily my parents have me and I was able to drive them, but even that. So who is the people that are making decisions about our community in terms of healthcare? I took them to get a vaccine. The folks out of 12 healthcare workers, only 2 of them spoke Spanish. And so there I was translating for the other seniors in the line. So, you know, it impacts us even later on. It impacts all of us. It's not just the folks that are impacted more directly, the Spanish speaking community, the folks of color that are impacted, you know, all those people. It's everyone gets affected by the lack of diversity, like the lack of diversity in thought too. I mean, you know, Don brought up, you know, even like who's making decisions and whose voices are we like centering in terms of how we make our decisions. That happens in research too. So earlier, you know, back in the day, or not even not that long ago, a lot of our information in terms of science and healthcare relied on white men. Like decisions on women and women healthcare were based on science that came out from white men. And so we need diversity in all aspects and decision making and thoughts and in all aspects of our society, and we all benefit from it.
Thank you all. That's really interesting. That's really great. So I want to kind of take this. I want to kind of build off what you were saying, Cynthia, about looking at the impact of COVID in different communities. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the impact of COVID and also how it relates to equity with regard to education and how it relates. I mean, there's a question here about school reopenings as well, and some communities being disproportionately affected by the reopening, of being at a greater risk of going back to school. I know this is a huge question, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there, and you can take it in any way that you'd like to, and talk just a little bit about this intersection between the current health crisis and the inequality that we have, and just looking at these issues of equity in education as well, particularly as we begin to reopen. So Tiffany, maybe you want to start us off, and we'll go from there.
Yes, I'm fortunate to work with several amazing equity leaders across the country in their districts, and I can't imagine there's any district that is doing well right now. I cannot imagine that there's a large bucket of students that are just amazingly growing. Everyone is experiencing some level of challenge. But what this COVID situation has done is for people that either refused or turned a blind eye to or were oblivious to the inequities in the education system, see them more clearly now. And it's unfortunate that it is something like that it took people to go, wow, I didn't realize that all these inequities were there. But even when you look at what's happening here locally, you know, we're bordered by 2 amazing tribal entities, Reno Sparks Indian Colony, Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, and having conversations about putting hotspots in places. Well, we've got 165 homes out at Hungry Valley that are Reno Sparks Indian Colony, and a hotspot there is not the same as a hotspot in south of Reno. And so people have had to be pushed to really start to examine some things, and they're still struggling to figure it out. And this COVID situation has shown that the haves and have-nots are wider and greater. Also, the assumption that people have made about the have-nots incapability has been checked, because we have resilient communities that can thrive with the right tools and resources. And if we don't assume incapability or lower level of intellect because of socioeconomic status, then we further widen the achievement gap. So this COVID inequity situation has just blown people's concepts of poverty and intelligence and learning at home and what resources look like, and has been able to, I think, really put a magnifying glass on some poor practices. And I'm not just saying a Washoe County situation, but across education.
I mean, I think you also are seeing it in terms of, I mean, on one, so there's that, it's what's happening in the homes too, you know, like, do they have access to a parent who could help, you know, that a lot of it, it's relying on the parent too, like, or, you know, do they have somebody who could help them with their homework and all that kind of stuff. So it adds to it. And let's be clear that, like, a lot of these inequities were there was a level of it. It just even got bigger, and it's coming out into light because more people are being impacted by it. And so there's more focus on these issues, right? But there was always a level of inequity there. In higher education, we're also seeing the impacts of COVID in terms of access to, you know, any type of technology. And I mean, literally any type. So like, there's an assumption that everybody owns a computer, for example. And that's not true. Not everybody owns a laptop. Not everybody has Wi-Fi. Not everybody has a phone. So some people may say, well, you know, they could use their phone. Well, if the hotspot on the phone is being divided by 5 other people in the room, then it's not reliable. And we're trying to use Zoom, which takes up a lot of that, you know, Wi-Fi. So it's inequitable in that sense. So higher education, you also have folks who, a lot of students of color, especially, I hear these stories of being the primary breadwinner for the family, and now having to mostly focus on, like, wherever I could get a job, I'm going to do it. And that may mean me delaying my higher education, which then, as research shows, the longer that they delay that, any type of break adds another layer of them being less likely to finish a higher education, which then now they're potentially not finishing a college education, but potentially, furthering their debt load, which then makes it even harder to get out of that poverty cycle for a lot of the students. You also have, you know, a lot of the students, a lot of conversations have been coming around in terms of, like, well, are people applying to college? And for a lot of colleges, they may see an increase because some folks may now be out of a job, and they may see higher education, especially in the community college system, as an opportunity to either get back or gain a certificate or whatever. But then, are we looking at retention? Like, are they staying for the next year? And even in grad school, like, we're focused a lot on the issues impacting our undergrad students, but even in the grad school, like, I know we were given certain topics to kind of reflect on for this meeting, and I got emotional thinking about it, because a lot of my students of color have had to deal with so much death. I mean, just the emotional toll of COVID, not just even financial and learning opportunities. When we're thinking about health too, like in terms of healthcare and folks pursuing STEM degrees, wanting to be doctors and so forth, the students who are coming from poor backgrounds are less likely to have those connections to then lead them into these things. So things like internships become so important for them, but they can't do it right now. So even that is furthering the gap in terms of opportunity for our students. Yeah, I'll stop there because I'm getting emotional thinking about it.
Well, thank you all. So unfortunately, we're running kind of short on time, or very short on time. But I do want to kind of end with one final question for you all. And this is probably the biggest one, and I'm going to ask you to do it in the least amount of time. So maybe if we could end with just maybe one thing that we could all work on and to build a more equitable or more equity in education. So maybe one kind of concrete step, and then maybe we could end and this idea of building equity, or kind of ways that we can all build equity. Don, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go around.
Listen to Tiffany and Cynthia. I think one of the things that we really have to think about is that we have to stop making this complex. It's about building relationships. And we have to think about how we build relationships with one another and how we look at one another from a humanistic lens. We all come with differences, and we need to embrace that that's a true fact about everything that we do and how we engage. When people are saying that these opportunities are not provided for me, or these opportunities are not there for me at the same level, we have to trust the experience of others and be willing to help figure out how to correct our systems that have created biases, hate, prejudices, and really be intentional about changing those things so that we all have an opportunity to be successful and to reach our potential, whatever that might be. We're beyond just having the conversation now. I think your question about action is one that we really need to take seriously and get moving on making our society better.
One concrete thing that I would say is probably look at the data. Look at the data. If there's doubts, look at the data. It'll tell a story in terms of inequity and inequality that is happening in our systems. That'll be my brief point.
And I'll just land with check your privilege, look at how you're using your power, and consider if it's causing any differences.
Thank you. That's really great. Thank you for your final comments. Thank you for all of your comments. I think this was really fantastic. I would like to keep going for like another half hour, 45 minutes, an hour. I know you all have things to do, so I won't do that to you all. So let me just wrap up then. I do have a number of people to thank, if I could do so quickly. I want to thank the Thought on Tap committee, Carlos Mariscal, Dani Enrique Perez, Meredith Oda, Catherine Fusco, Stephen Pasqualina, and Kaylin Early. I also want to give special thanks to Callum Ingram for helping to moderate the question and answer, and also to Gabriela Ortiz Flores for helping me to think about and frame some of these questions. I also want to thank Deborah Modelmog, Lisa McDonald, and the College of Liberal Arts, as well as Chris Stansel and Richie Bednarski for their support of tonight's event. I also want to thank our partners, Laughing Planet, and also K-Wink, where you can listen to this one, and also all of our events every week. I also want to thank our fantastic panelists. You all were really amazing. Thank you. This was really great. But most of all, I do want to thank everyone who signed in, everyone who watched today. I think it was a great event. There is a brief survey. Once you sign off, you'll receive the survey. Please take a minute, fill it out, let us know what you think, and if you have any suggestions as well. And that's really it. So on the thought, I messed up the final line. And on the behalf of Thought on Tap, thank you all so much. I'm Bretton Rodriguez. Thank you all. Have a good night.